today's video. Today we're talking about Benedict, and especially Benedict's rule, and really the sort of precedence that he sets. He doesn't think he's doing anything entirely new, but in some ways Benedict is a major game changer. Virtually all monasticism in the West is Benedictine in some sense. They're all trying to embody the ideals that he was able to sum up in that rule, that text that gives instructions for how to live a monastic life, how to live a life together in community as intentional Christians. So we're going to talk about some of his contributions today, kind of ask some preliminary questions in this video, and then come back. We're going to have to take a second video to look even more at the real theological contribution that Benedict makes and the ongoing effect of really not Benedict himself, but the ideals that he tries to embody, how they continue to sort of manifest themselves even today, and sometimes explicitly calling on the name Benedict when it happens. So I hope you enjoy these videos. I think that there's going to be some interesting content that we get to cover. So Benedict is writing at a unique time in history because Christianity is well established. If anything, it's sort of outpacing what was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, as it was formerly known in the West, has crumbled. Christianity is making inroads into parts of Northern and Western Europe in new ways. And what Benedict is able to do is take monasticism as it had previously existed and sort of pre-package it in a real entrepreneurial way. He's tried to establish a few different monasteries. He gets to some trial and error in there. And then he sort of is able to set up basically a franchise of monasticism. You take this rule that he's written and you adapt it to your situation. I mean, that's one of the real geniuses of it, is it's so adaptable. So he's taken things that John Cassian has taught before him, and John Cassian was one of his heroes, and yet John Cassian was really a rigorist, really strict. I mean, Cassian will say things like, if you're really a monk, you don't ever drink wine. No wine, just water. Well, Benedict's rule adapts that and says, oh yes, that's the ideal, but no monk's going to go without any wine at all, so he limits it, just about a half bottle a day or something like that. So Benedict's able to take these strict, clear practices and make them more palatable, more usable in a way. Another example is when Cassian had talked about disciplining monks. And remember, physical violence has already been sanctioned, right? You've already got just war theory writ large. And before that, you had the sense of disciplining a child, spare the rod, spoil the child. So the head of the monastery is like a father, and he is disciplining monks when they get out of line. And Cassian would say, no ifs, ands, or buts. If the monk is young, if the monk is old, if the monk is sick, same rod for the same crime. Benedict is able to adapt that. He's able to say, okay, here is the principle. You don't get out of line as a monk. Yes, there is this sense of discipline that even includes physical punishment discipline. But if there's a child in the monastery, maybe you just send the kid to bed without dinner. If the man is old, you don't beat an old man. If the man is sick. So he adapts this and makes it more palatable, more translatable to wherever people go. And when we say he can translate it, he's very comfortable outlining the specifics that you should do, but then allowing you to change them, your community. He'll have a whole long section in the middle where he talks about the Psalms. And remember, you would sing the Psalms. I mean, it wouldn't be the Gregorian, really slow chant that comes centuries later. You would sing these songs, and the Psalms are to be sung through every week. The whole Psalm book, it's your hymnal. And so he gives you specifics. Here's what psalm to read on the first day of the week, the first time of prayer. Here's what psalms to read on the second time of prayer. And on he goes, and after a kind of agonizingly long explanation of each psalm and each time and each day, he then ends it with this little throwaway line that says, or arrange it a different way, whatever works for you. And that's really what happens to Benedict's rule, is Benedict's rule sets up clear guidelines that are always adaptable. This is something that your community has to take and work it out for what's best here or there. And virtually everything else that comes after Benedict in the West is trying to is embodying that. It's taking Benedict's rule and saying, now how do we shape it for our needs? And sometimes the rule itself just completely falls out of use, but those principles. I mean, almost every monastic order in the West is trying to reclaim Benedict's ideals. They think that monks too easily slipped away from these, and so you have order after order refounded. The Benedictine order itself is actually later as an established order, but long before it was an established, recognized order. All monastics in the West were Benedictine in a sense. So remember, the main ideal that he's taking and adapting is really the ideal of all Christianity. It's the Acts 2 through 4 picture of the church where everyone is a part of the family. So you call each other brothers, or if you're in a nunnery, you call each other sisters. The head of the monastery is either the abbot or abbotess, the father or the mother. And so as this family, you share all things in common. It's the ideal church being worked out. Now, that raises a lot of questions. That raises a lot of questions about how does this relate to the church? How does this relate to what the church should be doing in the world? So we need to stop and kind of address those, tackle those head on. So if Benedict envisions the monastery as the ideal church, why do people need to do this monastic thing? Does Benedict seem to say that you're working toward your salvation or doing something that most Christians aren't getting? Is there some special saving effect? I mean, basically this comes back to an often asked question: is this works righteousness? That's the Protestant question that we can't help coming up with in many of these texts. I've already talked about this with Cyprian in his work on works and almsgiving, and also Anthony, the life of Anthony. So I would encourage you to go back and look at those videos. But here's one where I can add something to the discussion. I mean, one, if you look at what Benedict says in the opening and closing, there are times where he is incredibly clear on the role and need of grace in the Christian's life. But there's a whole lot in the middle that it just sounds like he's saying, do this in order to be saved. Now, a key here is to remember when he says salvation, like much of the Latin-speaking West at this time, he's primarily thinking sanctification. I mean, that even in the Bible, that word salvation can imply sanctification, or at times it can imply justification. And so if you look closely at what Benedict says, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how much grace is what started all of this, and God justified us by grace, and grace is what enables all of this and prompts all of this. It's grace sanctifying us. So how does he have such moments of clarity? The reason I feel so confident in him in this is because of what has come before him. With Benedict, we've jumped ahead a bit in the timeline. He dies around 527, and he's had the luxury of seeing some of the mistakes in the past and the aftermath of certain debates. So if you go all the way back to one of his heroes, Augustine, and Benedict is very Augustinian, Augustine had the famous debate with Pelagius. And Pelagius allegedly taught true all-out works righteousness. You could save yourself and you wouldn't need Jesus if you did all the right things all your life. And Augustine's response has to do with original sin. You're born into a position where you're never going to live that out. You need grace from day one. And as they debate, Augustine's pushed into a pretty extreme position because he wants to say that it's all grace all the time. Grace is what brought you to salvation. Grace is what saved you. Grace is what keeps you in salvation, and grace will keep you saved all the way. So everything is all God's grace. Now that's an orthodox position, but it's how he words it in the extreme that seems to override free will. And when I say overrides free will, you have to remember how Augustine is seeing this. He sees humans as fallen, and they rebelled against God, and now they're condemned. I mean, he called the human race, the whole world, he called the unsaved world, he called it the massa damnatio, the condemned lump, the condemned mass of sinners. And yet, out of this, God, by grace, called some. God called the elect to salvation. So, did anybody have free will in that matter? Not really. All freely rebelled against God, but God freely, this is single predestination. God called them out of that mass, the condemned mass, and made them part of the church. So, if I were to depict these for you, it's going to do terrible injustice and oversimplify. Pelagius probably didn't say exactly what Augustine said. He said Augustine is much more nuanced than anybody gives him credit for. And even these debates that come after just allow me to oversimplify to give an introductory to this issue. If you look at Pelagius, he is heard to say that because God is so high and we humans are so low, especially sinners, what we have to do is really work our way up to God. We have to do all the right things, faithfulness, faithful works. Well, Augustine says you'll never work your way up to God. So he says the opposite. It's all God coming down to you. It's all God's grace. Now, what happens in the debate afterward is some people are so worried that Augustine has making it all God, there doesn't seem to be any role for the human in this salvation process. There doesn't seem to be any sort of free will in the matter. God just overrides your fallen will, is what Augustine is heard to say. So there's a debate that takes place afterwards, and we go back to John Cassian. I told you Benedict is a fan of John Cassian. John Cassian will later be accused of being not technically a Pelagian, but a semi-Pelagian, that he still has this works righteousness bound up. So what he's heard to say, and again, this is not fair, but the semi-Pelagians are coming after Augustine saying, yes, God comes down to us, but God helps those who help themselves. We have to meet in the middle. God expects our actions, our response. And that's still some form of works righteousness. So that's actually going to be condemned at the Council of Orange, Council of Orange, in what is now France, the year 529. The council meets to tackle this issue, and the answer is at crystal clear. Pelagianism doesn't match the Bible, it's heresy. Semi-Pelagianism still doesn't match what the biblical teaching about salvation is, will not work. And so the solution, even though they're going to endorse Augustine, they're actually not going to endorse the sort of extreme ways that Augustine articulated it, where it sounded like he was overriding free will. The council is going to insist that it is all grace. God comes all the way down to us and saves us and prompts us to respond. And yet there is this moment of free will. We don't have to respond. It's not irresistible grace, like Augustine would say. And so God does come all the way down to us, but God expects us, now that grace has enabled us and prompted us, God expects us to respond in faith and with faithfulness and faithful works, etc. So if you were to kind of make your chart of all of these, both Augustine and Pelagius had what would really be a monergistic view of salvation. Monergism means one, mono, work, ergos. So this one work, Pelagius was heard to say it's all our work. Augustine insisted on saying it's all God's work, and yet that one is a heretical form and one is actually a very acceptable form. And yet, if Augustine's overriding free will, that's what people are worried about. There has to be this liberty, this choice that we humans have. So is it a choice that God waits for us to act? That's semi-Pelagianism. That still won't work, although that is that's a bad form of synergism. There is a sense in which Paul says we are co-laborers, sun ergos. We labor with God. And there's two working. There is God, but the orthodox answer for this at the Council of Orange is that you have to see God as always acting first. Anytime we respond to God and accept salvation or respond to God in prayer, we never come up with the idea to pray on our own or the desire to pray on our own. We always give credit that God called to us and we responded. We didn't have to respond. So that faith, second action, that there's two works, the synergy is required, but the order is critical. It's God first and then us. Now, that's what Benedict is alive during the midst of those kinds of debates. He dies just before that council, he's not working that council's language in, but all of those concerns are clearly on his mind because he bookends this whole rule, his whole text. He starts putting a ton of stuff in there about grace, and he ends by saying all of this was done by grace all along. So if in the middle he sounds like he's got a lot of works, I think he's safe. I think he is aware of the need to position this as God calling to us and us responding in faith. So grace first. So not everyone will remember that in the Benedictine tradition, and that's why we Protestants, coming in the wake of Martin Luther sees too many monks who forgot all of that talk about grace. And so there's fair questions for what this monastic tradition will become. But for Benedict himself, I think he's actually very sound. Okay, well, so much for individual salvation, but what about this collective group, the monks, or the nuns, in the monastery? If you're in this cloistered community, why? What makes you so special? Do you think that you collectively are something different than the church? Now, those are questions we'll have to come back to in the next video. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that, and we're going to tackle that and a couple other interesting sort of ramifications of what Benedict sets up for this idealized Christian life. See you next time. He's very entrepreneurial in a sense. He's able to sort of make